Hello to participants around the world. Welcome to the Global E-Conference, Turning the COVID-19 Crisis into an Opportunity. What's next for social protection? We have a great session set up today for people who have registered from all around the world. And we'd love to welcome a fantastic panel of speakers who will first answer some questions about why and how it is that a global fund for social protection is so important, and indeed how we feel its time has come. So first of all, I do want to acknowledge that this day 2 of this global conference is in fact October 7, wherever you may be in the world, World Day for Decent Work. It's very opportune that we have this session. Some of the other sessions held in this conference have also acknowledged that social protection is a human right. Less than 1/3 of the world's citizens are able to enjoy comprehensive social protection. My name is Alison Tate, and I work for the International Trade Union Confederation, the global peak body of trade unions representing unions in 165 countries around the world. I'll give a brief introduction to our topic and then hand to some of our panelists to expand on their background and knowledge in not just arguing for why a social protection fund is so important, but indeed how the crisis of COVID has brutally exposed the gaps between those people who have access to social protection and those who do not, including sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, healthcare. Workers in the informal economy, those in precarious forms of work, and women are especially likely not to be covered and especially economically vulnerable. Financing the extension of social protection and indeed ensuring a social protection floor in many countries is the topic of much debate. Within rich countries, social protection systems have been weakened, in many cases due to austerity. Within developing countries, economic growth has often not been inclusive at all, and is often not translated into increased investments into citizens through improved access to social protection. And in the least developed countries, where poverty and vulnerability are most acute, public resources are most constrained. It is clear that financing social protection is primarily the responsibility of national governments, who must prioritize government spending for their people, and who should create fiscal space. The International Labour Organization, and we're very privileged to have the Deputy Director of the Social Protection Department going to speak to us in just a moment. The ILO has done excellent work and has highlighted there are numerous ways by which governments can create fiscal space, including reallocating public expenditures, leveraging progressive taxation, and clamping down on tax evasion, to name just a few. But it's also becoming evident that international solidarity is needed, especially to support the expansion of social protection within countries that have limited domestic resources, and to build social protection floors where there are currently none. This is why today we are speaking of a global fund. Today in this session, we will hear speakers who will explain the concept of a global fund for social protection, why it is being supported by many actors, and how it could be set up and what principles could underpin it. Each of the panelists will speak for about 4 minutes, and then we'll open for those of you who would like to ask questions in the chat function. Please feel free to raise questions and address those questions to a particular speaker, or if in general you prefer to hear, I'll then, as moderator, nominate someone. I will be strict with the time as we have 1 hour together. So here we have, you will see in front of you on the screen, the list of our exceptional people who will be sharing with us. And I start by opening the floor to Valerie Schmidt, the Deputy Director of the International Labour Organization's Social Protection Department. Valerie, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Alison. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues and friends. So the COVID-19 pandemic has served as a wake-up call, alerting all of us, the global community, to the crucial importance of social protection. COVID-19 has also shown that it is not only the poor who are in need of social protection, but all members of societies, and that in absence of social protection, they can become extremely vulnerable. COVID-19 also reminded us more than 70 years ago, after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have not yet delivered upon our promise to make social protection a reality for all. Prior to COVID-19, we were already aware of the lack of social protection globally. We were not sleepwalking, but despite global awareness, there was insufficient political will, both at national and international level, to make social protection a policy priority. COVID-19 has at least been beneficial for one reason. It has put social protection high on the government's agenda and agencies' response to the crisis. We have seen once again that countries that already had well-designed social protection systems in place were able to rapidly guarantee access to social protection for their population. Countries that did not have strong systems in place had to innovate, sometimes with a fair degree of improvisation. But what is clear is that all countries around the world have mobilized to respond to the crisis and have done so by prioritizing social protection. According to our monitor, Social Protection Monitor, we know that within a few months, 1,500 social protection emergency measures have been adopted in over 200 countries. In most cases, these measures were emergency programs, but nearly 45% of them, of the measures, were actually adjustments of pre-existing schemes. In Togo, for instance, Togo decided to launch a new program called Novici, which means mutual help, to support informal economy workers that were really left behind with no social protection at all. Another example is Mozambique, where here the decision was made to expand a pre-existing cash transfer program to workers in the informal economy that again were left behind. Hence, if there is a silver lining to this crisis, it is really the widespread recognition of the necessity and value of social protection and the determination to build back better. And the crisis has also taught us that with political will, countries can indeed make social protection a reality. However, COVID-19 emergency measures are only temporary. They provide temporary support to populations, and after the COVID, these measures may not be sustained. These measures will not be enough also to protect people during this crisis, because sometimes we have temporary cash transfers of 1, 2, 3 months, and will not be sufficient to be built back better. So countries should really use the political momentum that we are now in to really try to transform these temporary relief measures into sustainable social protection systems. So we should really use this crisis as an opportunity to finally achieve universal social protection for all. We believe that it's now or never. However, we know also that the challenges are huge. Even before COVID-19, 55% of the world's population had no access to social protection at all. And in some regions, this exclusion is even worse, like in Africa, where 82% of the population has no social protection at all. We know at the ILO, and this is a shared understanding with all of us, that these large gaps in social protection coverage are actually linked to significant financing gaps. These financing gaps existed prior to the COVID, but it seems that with this crisis, they will become worse. We just updated a study that we produced in 2019, and we updated it to try to see what is the impact of COVID on the financing gaps. we know today that if we want to achieve the social protection floor by the end of this year, so by December 2020, developing countries will need an additional 1.2 trillion US dollar, which represents 3.8% of their GDP. For low-income countries, the amounts are lower, of only 80 billion US dollar, but they represent nearly 16% of their GDP, which is a relatively high share and may not sound realistic. However, we know also that closing the financing gap cannot be done in a few months. We need to do it in a progressive manner over a 10-year period by 2030, which is also in line with the objectives of the Agenda 2030. Because it takes time to develop social protection systems, it takes time to create new institutions, to pass laws, etc. So if we project these financing gaps and needs over a 10-year period, we demonstrate through this study that indeed countries should invest on average 2.2% of their GDP every year to achieve full coverage by 2030. And this figure is not only more realistic, but also more affordable. So we all agree today, as Alison mentioned, that there is a need to invest more in social protection. In principle, additional resources, additional investment should come from national resources. And there are many ways, as Alison mentioned as well, to increase domestic resources for social protection through reallocation of public spending, creation of new income, wealth taxes, or fighting illicit financial flows. A promising path that we are also promoting at the ILO is the extension of contributory social protection to workers in the informal economy, which would reduce the need for social assistance while increasing the contribution and tax base in the country and, of course, formalizing the economy. However, for low-income countries, where the social protection financing gap is relatively high compared to their limited fiscal capacity, domestic resource mobilization will not be enough if we want to achieve the social protection floor by 2030. So these countries in particular, should be able to seek additional international support, both financial support and, of course, technical assistance. You will tell me that this is already the case, that many international financial institutions and OECD countries are already providing such support. But the questions that we have are the following. Is this financing sufficient? Is it well coordinated with national domestic resource mobilization efforts? Does it always respond to national priorities? Is it used to build national capacities and as a catalyzer for domestic resource mobilization that in the end will be the only way to finance national social protection systems in a long-term and sustainable manner? So investing more in social protection is necessary. We all agree on that, but actually it's not sufficient. It is equally important to also invest better in social protection to ensure that the collection and allocation of resources allows for the establishment of sustainable, universal, comprehensive and adequate social protection systems. For the ILO and many of us in this room and in this conference, investing better implies that we respect, for instance, principles such as solidarity in financing between different groups, between high and low income earners, between those who have a good health and those with preconditions, etc. Investing better also means that policy options need to be discussed through national dialogues with also representatives of workers and employers and civil society, so that we have a shared vision and a coordinated action based on national consensus. But we also know from experience that these principles that are really at the core of our recommendation 202 that Alison mentioned are not yet a reality in many countries and are not systematically promoted by all development partners and IFIs. So what would be this global fund? This is what we are going to discuss, but I would like, prior to starting the discussion, to really share with you what was discussed 2 weeks ago in a high-level expert meeting organized by the government of France and the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. This high-level expert meeting was really on the establishment of a global fund for social protection. And Participants, of course, agree that this initiative is timely and should be pursued with great urgency. But at the same time, they explain that we are not starting from scratch. We should really build on what exists already. So, according to the participants and the discussions, this initiative of a global fund should rely really on two pillars, two main pillars. A first pillar is what we call a common roadmap to really guide all of us, countries, workers' employees organizations, civil society, development partners, IFIs, etc., to guide us in achieving more and better investments in social protection. So we should really have a common roadmap. And the second pillar is that we should have an increased coordination between institutions at the national level, between ministries of finance, ministries of labor, social partners, local and central governments, as well as development partners and IFIs. We should really ensure that technical and financial assistance support each other. So to develop a common roadmap, we need to strike a balance between different interests of all parties involved. And actually, this is how at the ILO we built international labor standards. And the social protection floors recommendation number 202, which was adopted in 2012 on an unanimous basis at the International Labour Conference, is one of these standards, and it provides concrete guiding principles on investing more in social protection and investing better in universal social protection. So we believe that this social protection floor recommendation could be used to shape this common roadmap. And regarding the second pillar, increased coordination,
wrap up,
we
please,
also,
Valerie.
sorry?
The second pillar is very important, but we need to bring it to a close also.
Yeah, I'm done. I have two more paragraphs. I'm
Okay.
done. So this second pillar, increased coordination, we really need to intensify our efforts. As I was saying, before the pandemic, UN agencies, IFIs, and many of us around this table rallied the objective of universal social protection. However, this consensus around a common objective should now be translated into through coordinated action at country level as well. So coordination of ideas and actors needs really to take place not only in global fora, but also in the ground, and involve ministries of labor, social welfare, finance, development partners, IFIs, workers and employers, and civil society around the same table. So my last point is that after a decade of promoting national social protection floors, and we all participated in that decade, now comes a new decade on financing more and financing better national social protection floors. It is time to agree on a common roadmap and increase coordination at all levels to make our common endeavor, social protection floors for all, a reality by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you to you. That's been a really thorough explanation of the rationale for an international solidarity-based financing mechanism, but also one that provides coordination between so many different actors. And now we're going to hear from some of those actors. It's a great pleasure to open the microphone to Gabrielle Fernandez. Gabrielle is the social protection specialist at the African Platform for Social Protection. Gabrielle, what role could a social protection fund play in supporting or strengthening national social protection systems?
Good morning to all, and afternoon to others. First of all, let me thank Valerie for really giving us a very good framing of the subject, and to highlight indeed what COVID has done in giving the political priority and importance of social protection, a challenge that we need to sustain. And for civil society, let me just first of all introduce the African Platform for Social Protection. It's a Pan-African network of civil society organization in 26 African countries, representing vulnerable groups, working for vulnerable groups as well, and supporting the state. And during the COVID period, they played a very important role in terms of not only in the provision, but also holding government account to their social contract. Which is vitally important. And this is a role that civil society will need to continue to play. Supporting also national governments in formulating policies and strategies. And now the focus is on building resilient social protection systems. We've seen COVID exposing a lot of weaknesses in the system. One of the weaknesses especially was around the registry identification and registration of vulnerable population. We've seen and we've heard a lot during the conference and during the very many wonderful webinars that Social Protection Org provided, what we call the missing middle. A lot of our program has been focusing in rural areas, and we have not done much in terms of the urban, especially where we have the highest number of informal workers. So we're now at a stage where we have to rebuild back better. This is the opportunity that we have. So the Social Protection Sort of Fund will be an important mechanism to support national efforts in coming up with or building very resilient social protection systems that are shock responsive and that also are responsive to climate change, the issue that we have of food insecurity currently, that will be a looming problem for us in Africa. But we have also opportunities that we can also build upon. And one of them is that the AU has now a social policy framework on social protection and a draft on rights of citizens to social protection will be presented to heads of state. This is an important instrument that we need support. So not only Africa, but many low-income countries basically support and just helping them to build system. I would like to bring in a very important tool that helped us to identify what we call the minimum package. And this is found also in the AU policy of establishing a social protection floor with the support of the ILO, which is vitally important. And I think this is where we need to build, we need to support national. So those countries that have actually implemented the national dialogue process and have identified a minimum package need to be supported in implementing that package. And to include now what we call the missing middle. And those who have not, to support them with this national dialogue, because the national dialogue brings together all the stakeholders, including civil society, to the table to come up with this minimum package. And within that context, now look at the nuts and bolts of the system. A key element and how do we support states in developing social registries, robust MIS systems. Civil society has an important role in working with grassroots and being able to also identify what we call vulnerability triggers, because we know that shocks will continue. We know that COVID has not gone and will probably remain with the impact of COVID, remain with us for quite some time. So we need to come up with vulnerability triggers that will support and that will allow national systems to prepare themselves to know how to respond and respond in a coordinated mechanism. And I know we're short of time, so I'm happy that Valerie has mentioned the emphasis on capacity building, which is critical, how to have the capacity to implement effectively. And lastly, to say that coordination, as you mentioned, is vitally important, but also coordination comes at a price. So it needs to be financed. It needs to be financed for it to work. And lastly, in terms of mobilizing national resources, whilst we agree that states need to harmonize their national resources, but we're talking about limited fiscal space. So what the fund can do is do the analysis to assist states in knowing how to best mobilize and to capitalize on providing the necessary resources for financing social protection. So these are some of the areas that we feel that the fund can be of tremendous importance and supporting civil society in that particular role. Thank you very much.
Gabrielle, thanks to you. Thank you very much. We will turn now to Marcus Manuel. Marcus is a senior research associate at the Overseas Development Institute. Marcus, what Gabrielle and Valerie have laid out is a very convincing case. How could a social protection fund be financed at for a global level? And what can we learn from earlier experiences of global funds?
Thank you very much, Alison, for the introduction, and for Valerie and Gabrielle, what you said. What I'd like to do, in the interest of keeping in time, is just focus on two ideas, two pieces of research that I want to present. So could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. So at ODI, the research institution I work at, back in 2015, we published a report that made the case for a global social compact, and particularly the need for a global fund to finance social protection needs. And this is because, as Valerie said, particularly in low-income countries, the possibility of financing social protection, even at a minimum level of lifting people out of extreme poverty, is just not affordable. And this is a slide from a paper that's going to be coming out in a month's time, which updates these gaps in the light of COVID. And what this does is it looks at how much can a low-income country afford. And it assumes, first of all, that the low-income country maximizes the amount of tax it can raise, in line with what the IMF and World Bank thinks possible. It secondly also assumes that countries live up to their international commitments on the AU commitment, for example, on social protection spend, the AU commitment on health. And it then identifies what the financing gaps are for each sector, because social protection, of course, is only just one of the needs. And what comes out of this is that, as you can see from the left-hand side, even the best finance sector, health, is struggling to make 16% of the financing gap we see in low-income countries. Water and sanitation then does next best, education the next, but social protection by far is the least well placed to be tackling this. And this for me is one of the key reasons why there's a need for a global fund for social protection. It's not just that there is a need to finance social protection, but there's a relative need to increase the focus on social protection. And unless we do something quite dramatically different, social protection is going to be the orphan in the middle of a set of packages that we know are really critical. It's not just social protection, that's part of education, it's part of water and sanitation, it's part of health. But at the moment, we're not delivering what we need collectively, and social protection is the worst off in all of those areas. So we hope this research will help build the case to persuade ministers of finance that there's not just a need, but there's a need relative to other sectors that they need to take account of. And then if I can have the second slide. A global fund is not just a matter of finance. There's much more about it. And these were a paper we wrote, which was with reference to justice, which is why you see justice as one of the icons in this. But lessons we were drawing about from the global funds. I think one of the issues that comes out is the degree of political commitment a global fund can help mobilize. I was privileged to be there when two ministers of finance, Minister of Finance from the UK, my boss at the time, and the Minister of Finance from Italy, got up and announced there was going to be a new global fund. That was the global fund that became the Global Health Fund. That was 19 years ago. It is now time that the recognition that was there 19 years ago about the need to mobilize attention for health needs to be done also in the issue of social protection. As Barry's mentioned, COVID has made the needs much greater, but it also has raised the awareness and the ability to think creatively. $9 trillion has been raised as part of the fiscal stimulus response to COVID-19. The world, when it needs to raise money, is able to do so when there is a clear need and when people can see what is going to be done with it. And this is where I think the Global Fund can help by taking that moment of opportunity and saying, this is how it can actually work in practice. This is the detail, this is where it's needed and how it can actually work. I think also what's come out of the recent debates is the potential to consider new ideas. And I think the idea that the SDR allocation, and particularly the idea of placing that in a trust fund, we can discuss this in more detail if we want to afterwards, I think is a particularly interesting idea. And the final piece of finance that I want to put on the table is related to climate. We do know that climate finance is, the adaptation to climate is a key thing that social protection is helping with. It's not merely a response to COVID, it's not merely a response to inequality, it's also a response to the climate change, particularly in the poorest countries. And COP26 next year provides an opportunity to really seriously engage about climate finance, which at the moment is very inequitably distributed, is imbalanced between mitigation and adaptation, and is imbalanced in terms of support it's providing for poorer countries. So I think the Global Fund, again, will help mobilize that degree of political commitment around it. There are other lessons that we could talk about afterwards, and I'm very happy to share the paper, but let me just leave it there as a bit of an introduction, a bit of a taster. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's really brilliant to have that both historical perspective, but also to be looking forward beyond the crisis and the intersection of crises that we currently face to connect what a global social protection fund could provide. That's very helpful. We now turn to another Marcus, to Marcus Kaltenborn, who is a professor of public law at Ruhr University Bochum in Germany. Marcus, you've done a lot of work, including with the ILO, on principles. What are the important principles for the design and governance of a global fund for social protection?
Thank you very much, Alison. It's a pleasure to be with you and the colleagues on this panel. You asked me to say a few words on the governance structure of a potential global fund. As already mentioned, the French government has organized a conference on this topic last week. There's been definitely a lot of support for this idea, but it has also become apparent that some actors are still somewhat reluctant. Therefore, one might be asked whether it makes sense to start thinking about a governance structure for such a fund already at this stage. I believe this could be indeed very useful, because if there is a bit more clarity on this point, it might be easier to overcome some of the reservations about such a new institution. It is important, I think, to be aware of two things. A governance structure does not have to be invented completely new. Rather, there are a number of examples in the global development architecture from which we can learn. And Marcus already has mentioned these lessons from global funds. And it should also be clear that there are well-defined rules under international law for setting up new funding mechanisms. On the one hand, these are the 8 effectiveness principles, which we all know, for example, from the Paris Declaration or the Busan Partnership. On the other hand, the standards that have already been developed for financing social protection must, of course, also be observed, especially those arising from human rights norms and from relevant ILO documents. What does this mean now for a new international financing mechanism? The first 8 effectiveness principle that would be important is country ownership. Each international initiative which aims at supporting social protection floors must carefully respect this core principle. It is solely up to the recipient countries to decide on the concrete shape of their national social protection floors, even if they are temporarily co-financed by international donors. Therefore, the decision-making structures of a new fund must be designed in such a way that no decisions can be taken against the will of the recipient countries. But on the other hand, of course, we also need rules which ensure that the group of donors cannot be outvoted in a majority decision. At first sight, this seems to be a rather difficult task, but I don't think that this will lead to major problems. There are mechanisms proven in international practice by which the interests of all actors can be adequately protected. And then we should be aware that both ILO norms and human rights request a balanced stakeholder representation in the governance structure of the fund. This means that employers, workers, and civil society organizations need to participate in the decision-making bodies of the fund. Tripartite representation structures are necessary according to the relevant social security standards, for example, according to Recommendation 202. And civil society groups which represent the potential beneficiaries, which means those people who are in need of social protection and therefore can claim their right to social security, these groups also have a right to participate, at least if we take the rights-based approach in international development governance seriously. Therefore, both social partners and civil society representatives must have the opportunity to bring their views into the decision-making and monitoring processes of the fund. Again, we have good examples in international practice on which we can build. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, for example, could be an interesting model here. Now I would like to come to a further principle of the eight effectiveness agenda to coordination. Improving the coordination of international cooperation in social protection finance would be probably one of the key functions of the new fund. I know there are already coordination mechanisms in place, mainly USP 2030 and SPEAC-B, but we still have severe problems with overcoming the fragmentation of international financing. A global fund could streamline and upscale the existing well-functioning forms of cooperation. And of course, it would also coordinate its own financing efforts with these already existing activities. In my view, this would be an important added value of the fund from which all actors would clearly benefit. And last but not least, a further eight effectiveness principle is accountability, which mainly means transparency and mutual responsibility of all actors. To some extent, this can be already provided in advance by the participation mechanisms in the fund's organizational structure. However, decisions taken by the fund's bodies must also be subject to subsequent review. For example, representatives both of the donor side and of recipient countries should be given the opportunity to check compliance of all decisions of the fund with the agreed guidelines and policies. And of course, it is equally important that the governments of the recipient countries are accountable to the fund for the correct use of the financial resources. Therefore, regular reporting, monitoring, and evaluation are the key instruments in this respect. When it comes to designing the organizational structure of a global fund, there will be certainly much to learn from both the experiences with other financing institutions and other global actors. I'm sure if we carefully consider these experiences, then we can succeed in setting up a very efficient structure for a global fund. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marcus. Very thoughtful and very thorough. On that basis, Sulistri, we are now going to hear from Sulistri Afrilestron, who is the Deputy President of the Indonesian Trade Union Confederation, KSBSI, joining us from Jakarta. Sulistri, you have a lot of experience in Indonesia in dialogue processes for developing and expanding social protection, including for informal economy workers. What role is there for trade unions and civil society in the development of a global social protection fund? And why is it important that trade unions and civil society organizations have that role of participation?
Thank you, Alison, and good morning all. So the role of the trade union and civil society in the Global Fund for Social Protection at the national level is very important, because trade union and CSOs, they will convince the government, likewise for the parliament, to accept the idea of Global Fund for Social Protection as the way government to financial social protection, which still facing serious challenge. How to fulfill the gap of the million workers and people still have no access to get social protection due to the country financial difficulty. The other argument to convince the government is also mentioned by Valerie, that about the crisis, but also this is related the impact of the COVID-19, where many workers lost their job, including the domestic and also migrant workers. The other situation is also will give impact to the achievement of the SDGs target in 2030. Just for the information that there are several policies on social protection that has adopted by Indonesia government to eliminate the impact of the COVID-19. Example like the various tax subsidies, such for the income tax for the workers. And then starting next year, 5 million people, particularly for the vulnerable informal economy, will receive the contribution of assistance. And then the government also has policy on the wages subsidies for the workers who are member of the BPJS Ketenagakerjaan, the Social Security Manpower Implementer. So in Indonesia, we have two implementer Social Security. First is Social Security for the health, and then the second is Social Security for the manpower. So for the manpower, Social Security manpower consists 4 programs for the pension, and then for the old age or the death insurance is also for the working accident insurance. So they give the subsidized around $40 a month for 4 months. And then also there is a pre-employment card that this is distributed to the workers who lost job because of the COVID through the virtual training and also incentive. And also, of course, the cash transfer and also distribute the basic needs. And also for the poor people, subsidies for the electricity tariff also given. And then also for the employer, the government also has the policy to give the relaxation to the workers' social security program contribution for the 6 months. And then the other important rule of the trade union, the trade union and CSO should have research evidence based document as the way of them to convince the idea of a global fund for social protection to the public. Because we need support for the public to convince the government that the global fund for social protection is very important. It's not only to respond the impact of the COVID, but we need the sustainable social protection at the country level. And then the other rule is for comprehensive sustainability and a broadly supported social protection system. All the group of the actors have to be involved and fully engaged. The government, economic actors, and representative demand relevant civil society. It's not only a general rule, it is the best guarantee to really reach and cover all vulnerable groups in society. And then why important the role of the trade union at the national and also international level? So in the national level, it's similar. We don't want to be a top-down. We mean that top-down fund where all the decisions are made at the international level. Since a fund should be strengthening at the national system, national organizations have to be effectively involved in priority setting, in management, in monitoring, and also in evaluation. And then this is also to guarantee the inclusive approach. Global Fund for Social Protection need to involve the relevant and representative civil society and trade union. People have to be represented on this. Can only be done through involving in a relevant CSO. They have to be involved in setting priorities in the management of the program. This means, among other things, that local social partner and civil society organization should be closely involved at the level of each individual program. It also implies social protection based on right and solidarity between all residents of a country. The last but not least, I think important for trade union to be ensure that the program comply with the ILO standard and relevant declaration. I think that's all, Alison, for the moment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Terima kasih. I would now like to really build on these excellent points by turning the microphone to Michael Shishon. Michael is here representing the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors. He has been doing work for decades, in fact, including in his current role as Professor Emeritus of Social Protection at the United Nations University in Maastricht. Michael, what barriers do you see that need to be overcome to ensure the political will for countries and international institutions to prioritize realizing a global social protection fund?
Well, I'll try to be very brief, so I know you need to have some space for discussion here. But I see the key obstacle is the lack of understanding on the part of governments and institutions and probably societies about what that fund actually is and what the nature and the size of the fund is. And I think I will try to shed some light on this. So I have 4 points and I'll just go to them quickly. So first of all, governments and institutions need to understand the nature of a fund. And the nature of the fund basically means that there is, as a source of money that kicks in if a government or a country sort of hits a certain trigger level of social expenditure. It could be 10%. It could be 10% of their GDP, and everything that goes beyond the fund would help to finance, or it would finance a share of the overall bill. That needs to be defined, but there needs to be a certain trigger that's clearly understood. We are not just supporting everybody, we're supporting people in the urgent needs. And if we look at our own calculations in the Global Coalition, at the moment we have about 10 to 12 countries that would qualify, not more. And then the object of our support needs to be clearly defined. We are not we're not going out there to support extravagant social protection schemes for the military, the police, or some part of the civil service. What we're trying to achieve is floor levels or support is floor level social protection that really combat poverty and insecurity. Then we need to understand that this isn't an open-ended commitment. This isn't the huge figures. Valerie said, these are the total gaps in social protection financing. But if you look at the 10 to 12 countries, and we say, we'll finance sort of half of their expenditure that would be needed to actually fill the gaps in the SPF, in the social protection floor, we're talking about 10 to 15 billion to start with per year, which is still 3 times the size of the Global Fund for AIDS. So it's no small feat in an international context, but it's much more manageable and more realistic, and it doesn't frighten people off to the same extent that if we were to mention the huge gaps that there are. But there is a limit, and even if we were to limit ourselves to only 5 countries in the first place, we could probably reduce that, the 5 worst off poorest countries. We could limit ourselves to half that or less. So, and the fund would sort of support these 5 countries as long as they need that support, and then we'll roll on to a next 5. So, and there needs to be a clear exit strategy as well. So that's the nature that we need to understand. And the countries need to understand that this isn't a freebie. Countries have to support and finance a major share of their social protection themselves and for all time in future. But we need to understand the effect. Even a small fund, even if we were only to support 10 to 12% of the countries, and that support would succeed to pull everybody to the $1.90 level, which is a miserable level, agreed, but it's a first step. Then we could pull 120 million people out of that abject poverty, which is 15% of the total number of people that are currently living it, probably a little less after COVID. So that means there is a concrete step forward in sort of reducing abject poverty. And that is actually what we want to achieve, a tangible result. The fund will also support technical support, of course, that make the social protection systems better and more resilient in future. I'm not in favor of sort of saying, well, this is all COVID. This isn't COVID. We had a social catastrophe out there before. The world's a pretty miserable place for 50% of its population. Let's not forget it, and that was before COVID. So the need was there. COVID sheds a light on it, but we're not here to solve the fallout of COVID. We're here to solve or help to address solving the structural problems. Well, governments need to understand that we can bundle aid by this instrument. Bundling aid means, and I think that's what we all need to understand, that we have to overcome some of our egoisms. I mean, if you put your resources into a fund, you lose discretion over its use. And the use of money is power. So you give up power for the better good of a coordinated concept to address social protection, right? And that is a huge decision in some institutions. And some civil society institutions have the same problem. I don't want to hide that, right? So if you bundle, you help better, but you give up some of your discretion and some of your political and the opportunity to use the fund for your resources for political ends. So that is a major step forward, but it needs to be understood and we need to sell it. We need to sell it. And finally, I think my final point is simply, we need to understand that in a global world, we cannot solve the inequalities in this world that actually threaten the standard of living everywhere in terms of social crisis, economic crisis, health crisis, migration crisis on a national level anymore. And we need to put up a first sign that we are serious about it, not just setting goals, but also putting the means towards the end. And one of the means is a global fund. As I said, we can start modest. And I'm saying this, and I have no mandate from my coalition, but I say this again, if governments fail, and I say this in every meeting, if governments fail to do so, civil society has to go ahead anyway, right? And we have to set up a fund and then invite others to join. And there's nothing better than the normative power of the fact. So I leave it at this for the moment. I know that my colleagues don't want to hear the last point, but I think it needs to be made. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now, I haven't done a great job at managing time because we have only 7 minutes left, but there have been some interesting questions coming in the chat. And I would ask that each of the panelists look there where you might be able to answer in writing. But Musa was the first to mention the context of Lebanon and the catastrophic economic conditions there before COVID, before the devastating explosions, but now also. So to answer that question, I'd like to ask someone to raise their hand. When we speak about a global social protection fund being able to mobilize resources and the political commitment for coordination at a global and national level, what does that mean for middle-income countries like Lebanon that may have then faced such a crisis? Gabrielle also mentioned the impact of climate change and trying to address the multidimensional aspects of ensuring sufficient climate finance. So I wonder if Valerie, in the first instance, would you be able to address the point of prioritization of funding to low-income countries and middle-income countries? And then we'll come back to Gabrielle on climate change. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alison, and thanks for the question from Musa. I think Gabriel already answered the question through his presentation of the case of his country. He was referring to a process that we call at the ILO assessment-based national dialogue that really helps countries in putting all the relevant actors around the same table. So of course the line ministries in charge of social protection, but also the ministries of finance and ministries of planning, as well as civil society, workers and employers organizations, social security institutions and programs, and the development community, so both the World Bank, IMF, if they are available, and the UN agencies, including the ILO, and also bilateral development partners, putting everybody around the table to look at the social protection situation, to identify the gaps, and usually there's a lot of gaps. Also implementation issues, because sometimes the laws exist, but they are not implemented. And then trying to define what would be the national social protection floor in the country. So of course, this really requires a lot of discussions, as Gabrielle explained. And then trying to have different scenarios. Of course, countries usually cannot cover everybody at the same time. So they need to have scenarios to progressively develop their social protection floor, costing these scenarios, and then having a real discussion on financing, which is missing in many cases when the ministries of finance are not at this table or when the IMF and World Bank are not coming to the table. So it's very important that these national dialogues are not done only between ourselves, between like-minded people who really are policymakers who really want to advance the agenda, but also those who have their say on finance. And I think this ABND exists. It has been applied in 60 countries already, both low income and middle income countries. So please consult our webpage with the ABND methodology, and we are here also to respond. And actually in Lebanon, we have a great specialist, Luca Pellerano, who of course will respond to this request. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabrielle, there's a question about the gap of 80% of social protection in countries, in many African countries. Indeed, that number is greater in some. The question is, I'm wondering how those countries will have the priority to access such a fund considering the need and vulnerability. I'd like to ask Gabrielle to reply and then Marcus Kaltenborn.
Thank you. That's a very important question. As Michael quickly pointed out, and as we view it, the fund basically has a catalytic role. So it is not necessarily that you're funding or you are assuming state responsibility, but it's using it as a catalytic tool. To give an example, for instance, many budgets do not have social protection as the budget line. It is normally hidden under social development. So what happens is that, and under social development, you have a mix of other social activities that are competing. So it gets lost. So what the financing from the social protection fund can do is to help some countries restructure the budget that allows for a budget line for social protection that the fund now can match. And I sort of like that idea that Michael is throwing out, that we will match. If you can provide 10%, we provide 20%, and if you can provide 5%, we can provide 20%, okay? And direct it towards specific social building the system, and I can bring a linking to climate change, so it becomes adaptive and shock responsive.
Thank you. And Marcus, following on from that point in terms of the governance structures, you mentioned the principles of being nationally owned. In terms of global distribution of funds, and the question about the role of SPIAC-B, I've just got a message from the socialprotection.org organizers that we can take 5 to 10 more minutes. So if people are willing to do that, then we can have a few more minutes to hear from each of the panelists. Marcus, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. You asked me for saying something on on the country ownership principle. Maybe I can take also the opportunity to answer another question from the chat, because Charlotte asked what are the challenges and the roadblocks for a global social protection fund, especially from and for international organizations. And I think this is a very, very important question. We know that there are several organizations globally and regionally active who have social protection in their portfolios. Of course, ILO on the technical side, and World Bank, for example, on the financial side, but several other actors like UNICEF, FAO, and the regional development banks are also active in this field. And I think it is very important, as Michael already mentioned, that we have to overcome the egoisms in this international sphere, that we need not only common aims, we have this common aim on in SPIAC-B, as you mentioned, Alison, and also at USP 2030, but we need more coordination, I think, and for example, especially more cooperation. And I think the Global Fund could be a very good instrument to overcome these separated priorities and separated interests, and to overcome these egoisms. And therefore, I think this fund is needed very much. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Perhaps not everyone knows this acronym of SPIAC-B, so I would just say the Social Protection Interagency Cooperation Board, co-hosted and coordinated between the ILO and the World Bank. Please look that up on the internet if you have more questions, or come back to the colleagues who are involved. The question that has been raised about financing in regards to the current burden, the debt burden of many developing countries, has been raised by Victor. And the point about developing countries' capacity to access and utilize funds and actually to mobilize their own domestic resources has been mentioned by a number of panelists. I wonder, Marcus Manuel, if you would have an additional point to address some of the points coming up in the chat box on that.
Thank you. Obviously, there are a variety of financing sources that can be considered, but I think, COVID crisis has revealed that debt is not going to be one of them. Too many countries are already at debt distress levels to be seriously considering this is something that's needed to be done. So while debt was important, the World Bank lent to Brazil to help them set up their first social protection efforts under Bolsa Familia. I don't really see that as being a major source for what's happening. I also think we need to be very clear about the relative capacities to tax. A typical middle-income country already has 100 times the tax capacity that a low-income country does. So in middle-income countries, yes, and our study shows there's an extra 1.9 trillion that middle-income countries could be raising in tax. So that's a really important part of it. But if we want to set social floors at the level that Michael talked about, the $1.90, it's a miserable level, but it's a starting point. If we want to do that, poor countries like DRC, they cannot do this. They can't afford 10% of GDP. They struggle to raise total tax of 10% of GDP, and they've got many other needs that they need to finance. So I think we just need to be realistic. And this is why I think it's important to look at cross-sectoral issues and not just to see social protection, because if you look at social protection by itself, of course you can say, well, if all the money in the world was given to social protection, then we can solve the problem. We need to have some sort of balanced approach. But also we just need to be ambitious, because the statistics that Valerie mentioned, the scale is massive. If we want to move beyond, millions of people having social protection in low-income countries to hundreds of millions of people having social protection, we do need something transformation. But I agree with Michael, we need to work out what's the first bite-sized step. I think that's part of the process along the way. But I also think it's why things like SDRs, climate finance, I think that's where I think we can find tens or hundreds of, tens of billions, which is the sort of figure we should be starting to think of.
Thank you so much. We do need to bring the session to a close, and we're already 5 minutes over time. So I'm going to really take this moment to thank our panelists so much for not just the presentations today, but your ongoing commitment and work. You are real champions for this work. And to thank all the participants who've come together and joined us in this conversation. It's clear that we have a big job to do in not only the advocacy and education work around what a global social protection fund could be and what it isn't, but indeed, I'd therefore like to acknowledge Nicola's work and the work of the coordination of civil society groups behind the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors that have hosted this conversation. And indeed, I'm going to hold up a paper version you can see this on the website, of a call whereby more than 200 civil society groups have put their names and commitment behind advocating for such a fund. Indeed, we do so within the global trade union movement as well. But I would like just to say that many of the points brought here today are important for us all to advocate on. The role of the Global Social Protection Fund in calling for investing more and investing better, as Valerie mentioned. That this is not about charity, it's actually about providing a floor, a foundation for what is required as a minimum to address poverty and indeed provide dignity. It does not mean it's a ceiling in terms of adequacy, not at all. The point of a global fund to support those countries that do not have the financial capacity currently to establish a social protection floor, to participate in a way, as Gabrielle speaks about, in functioning between governments, social partners, civil society actors, in ensuring a social contract in the poorest countries and in many countries that are suffering where huge inequality means that even in some of the richest countries, we see that social protection has not been adequately funded. Indeed, in recent decades under austerity has been defunded. So we need to really ensure that at a national level, the design and implementation and monitoring, as well as accountability for not just the spending of public funds, but indeed the accountability of our very democracies, demand that the political commitment of governments take seriously the responsibility to provide for the social protection needs of their citizens as a fundamental human right. So I would just really thank all our speakers today for bringing your wisdom and sharing so generously the ideas. And I know we weren't able to address all the questions that came from the chat, but we hope that you do participate actively in the social protection community globally. And we really just thank the organizers for making this opportunity to focus on the needs for a global social protection fund. The moment is now, the time has come. Thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.